We had a listener specifically ask Nick a question about stuff that you've talked about in your story, specifically how fantasy sports was one of the slippery slopes for you in your story. And the listener just wanted to have us unpack that. And I thought that it was a good idea to kind of use that as the topic of slippery slopes and try to figure out really where these are in our lives and how to be careful on the journey of healing and how to navigate all of these. So to kind of start, will you just kind of set the stage? Maybe people haven't listened to this, Nick, but you've mentioned fantasy sports being a slippery slope. Talk us through what that was like.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to kind of talk about that is to have in mind the FASTER scale. And I think a lot of our listeners are aware of that, but just in case you're not, the FASTER scale is an acronym. It's an emotional inventory that we take on our way down to relapse, which is the R of FASTER. But the other acronym or the letters are forgetting priorities. A is anxiety, S is speeding up, T ticked off, E exhausted, and then R relapse. And one of the things we talk about that forgetting priorities is that first step away from trusting God and others, living in recovery, paying attention to my responsibilities and principles and, doing the things that God has called me to do. And so there's nothing wrong. I just want to say this, there's nothing wrong with enjoying sports or playing fantasy sports. But for me, that was very often the forgetting priority step because it meant that I was beginning to procrastinate. And I didn't know this in the moment. It was part of my recovery journey to realize that would become something when there were difficult tasks in front of me, assignments that I didn't feel certain about, a phone call I needed to make that was making me a little anxious. It was easier to just go online and waste time, on my fantasy football team, which was what was kind of funny about it to me. Football games happen once a week, or now it's like 4 days a week, but in general, you could go, in theory, set your team for the week and look at it one time and then just let your, let the players play. But I was multiple times a day going back to my team, reading up on, and some people do this, which again, if you do it in a healthy way, it's fine. But I was spending inordinate amounts of time just kind of looking at my team, proposing trades, thinking about who's going to do well, reading up on the odds makers. And really, it had become a way that I was avoiding things I needed to be doing, which then became part of my pattern that now I'm more anxious because I still haven't done the thing that I need to do. Yeah. And then I would rely on enough anxiety to kick me into speeding up mode, and then that wouldn't work and I'd be ticked off. And it just became part of the progression where very often as well, when you are on a slippery slope, it's a place where you tend to encounter triggers. And as you know, when you're playing fantasy sports, the things that can come up for advertisements that are directed towards men and their sentimentalities and the kind of things that are of interest to them, sooner or later, there can tend to be some sexualized ads. And I would find that over the course maybe of several days or even several weeks, that pattern would be what was taking me back into my old and addictive behavior. And so it was having a willingness to realize in and of itself, fantasy football was not a bad thing. But for me, it had become part of my slide down the scale towards relapse, and it had become very predictable. It had become part of that pattern. So for a number of years in my recovery, that was just an area of my life I had to eliminate because I had learned, as we've talked about in other podcasts, that it's not that we need to fight our pattern or our behaviors at the end of the scale before we're tempted to relapse. It's learning to not even get on that scale, to not even go down that path. And so for me, that was seeing this as one of my entry points. And if I block the entry point, I just don't go that way. And that was a much more successful strategy. So that's kind of the overview of what had gone on in my own story.
Yeah, it's good. And I think that's helpful too, because that gives us a framework as we continue through the conversation of maybe it isn't fantasy sports, but maybe there are other things that end up being that top line of us sliding down the scale.